Hello everyone, Happy New Year and welcome to my first video of 2025. It has been very frosty and snowy lately, so I have been going out almost every day to capture videos and photos, mostly to paint from in the warmth of my studio. And because of this, I have been really into painting snow, especially snowy forests. So I want to show you how I painted this little snowy field and forest scene, but I'm going to especially focus on talking about water control because this is one of the most requested topics in my gouache videos. So if you have ever struggled with getting the consistency or the water control that you need to get the effects you want with gouache, stay tuned. I'm going to give you lots of tips. I had to start this video with lots of snowy footage to get you in the mood, but let's head into the studio and get cozy, grab a cuppa, and let's talk about gouache. Now, first things first, you can see my little reference photo up there on the left, but I want to point out that I'm not trying to copy this photo exactly. I'm just kind of using it as loose inspiration. You can see in my tiny little ink thumbnail on the top right that I've already changed the composition to what I originally saw. What I love about this photo is the dramatic lighting. So the forest beyond is very shadowy, and then the front trees are illuminated with a warm glow. And then in the foreground, we have a nice warm field with a really cool pathway. And because I mentioned I've really been into painting snow lately, I'm also imagining this is kind of a snowy scene. So after I paint it, I'm going to do some final touches with a bit of snow. Of course, I'll talk you through how I do that. But in order to prepare myself to paint this kind of dramatic lighting, I need to lay the groundwork. And to do that, I'm using a very, very dark underlayer for the trees particularly. I need to make sure this is dark enough so that anything I do on top, like the highlighted areas of trees and the snow, is really going to pop against this dark. These are the shadows. These are the depths of the trees where light isn't penetrating the forest. And the reason I'm using a cool color like blue is that I want the shadows to be cool and the highlights to be warm. This is what gives this kind of glowing light effect, late day sun hitting the fronts of these trees. I do think the photo in general was a little bit too warm overall, so I'm going to drop the temperature in the trees just a tiny bit, add a bit more cool green here and there. But for the most part, I am focusing on that play between warm and cool. Now let's talk about water control for this first layer. I'm actually using day-old gouache here. It's a little bit stickier than if I had just freshly poured it out of the tubes. And because of that, it's a little bit trickier to get it to spread. I do this all the time though. I will pour gouache out and then I'll cover it or put it in one of my Stay Wet palettes, and then the next day I'm using lesser than fresh gouache. Sometimes my first layer is going to be very diluted and more of a wash of color, and that's fine. But when it comes time to do the second or third or even final layer, these are things we have to think about. This also happens if you're using gouache for a long time and it's just exposed to the air. It just dries out. It gets a little bit stickier and you get a lot of brush drag. The tendency is now to dip your brush in the water and use water to thin it down and spread it and get that nice flow. However, in doing so, you are diluting the gouache, which can result in drying a little bit darker or lighter depending on what you're working on. And it can also be transparent, which is not always the effect that we want. So to combat this a little bit, what I will do is when I first sit down, I'll give the palette a nice gentle spritz of water, just a very thin coating, and that will sink in and soften the outer layer of gouache. So what I do is I try to use as little water as possible to get the paint to flow. This allows me to see the gouache at its full strength and work a little bit easier, because as soon as you introduce water, you're going to end up with different consistencies and colors and values, and it's just much more of a surprise. So now and then you're going to see me dipping my brush in the water, but I'm only dipping the very corner of the brush. And sometimes I do this directly before or directly after mixing a color. The whole point of that is to just introduce a tiny amount of water, which is going to soften the gouache instantly and allow me to get a little bit more reach with that brush stroke. This painting, however, calls for a lot of dry brush. So I'm actually happy that my gouache is a little bit stickier because it's going to help achieve that dry brush effect really easily. And for the most part, after I'm done with my first layer, everything is dry brush. It's going to be lots and lots of overlaying, really sticky dry brush strokes. This is how I achieve that very painterly effect and get a ton of variety in only a couple brush strokes. And if you're brand new to gouache or just really interested in painting trees, over on my Patreon this month, I'm doing kind of a mini crash course in trees. I'm going to show you how to draw them, kind of go over the basics, and then my paint along next week is going to dive into how I paint trees and kind of go from the ground up, no pun intended, or maybe that was intended, I don't know. So check it out if you're interested. I'll put a link in the description. Okay, back to the painting. In between major color changes, or when I'm switching between using more or less white, I will completely clean my brush off. White seems to clog the hairs a lot quicker on my brush, so I will very often completely clean, kind of refresh the brush every once in a while when I'm using a lot of white. Speaking of which, my final step on this first layer is to fill in the sky color. I just need to get rid of the color of the paper because it's very distracting. It doesn't allow me to see the full value range that I have already in my painting. The sky and the highlights on the snow that I'm adding later are going to be the brightest parts of the painting, so having this in the painting now will give me an idea of how far I need to stretch into my darks as I do the trees. And once I'm done filling in this first layer, I'm going to let it completely dry before moving on to the second layer, because again, I want a lot of dry brush and I can't achieve that if this first layer is wet. One of the struggles a lot of beginners face with gouache is when you're layering, you can actually reactivate what's below it. So if you use a lot of water on your brush in the second layer, or the first layer isn't completely dry, it will instantly mix with what you're using. This is sometimes the result of using too much gouache in a second layer as well. What I want to emphasize in this painting is that I'm never loading up tons of gouache on my brush, especially in the second layer and the third layer. One thing I see beginners doing is using too much water and too much gouache on the brush in the second layers. This can lead to a lot of muddy mixes or reactivating the colors below, and then they combine with the new colors you're using, and that can potentially lead to undesired mixes. So when in doubt, use less gouache and use less water. As I mix these greens for the second layer of the trees, you can see how small my piles are. And I'm constantly touching in a bit of yellow, a bit of red, a bit of blue and brown here and there. I want a lot of variety. But as long as I make these greens a lot warmer and a lot lighter in value than the background, they're going to start bringing those leaves, or actually their pine needles, forward. In comparison to the dark shadowy layer I've already done, all of this is standing out and giving it more of a 3D effect. But it's all very thin, dry brush strokes layered on top of each other, slowly building up that variety. At the end of the painting, I'm going to show you a close-up of the results so that you can see how incredibly rough it looks. Even though when you back up a little and kind of view it as a whole, things make sense. It looks like a tree, it looks like a pathway in a field. Up close, it looks very, very abstract. That's personally my favorite way of painting. I like when certain areas of the painting remain very abstract and then other sections are more realistic and recognizable. I think something that helps create a lot of depth in trees scenes like this, when there's just a lot of trees all together, just big clusters of trees, is not to over-render every single tree. I'm hinting that there are a lot of trees here by painting just very faint trunks down below and lots of little peaks at the top, but I'm only going to add highlights and more detail to a few of those foreground trees. I think it's actually really helpful to look at snowy tree photos because the snow rests on the top of the branches, and this helps define the different sections and the different shapes of branches. So when you first look at a tree, you might think, oh, that's just a big blob, it's a big shape. But I think seeing the snow resting on the branch kind of helps define the areas that would be catching the light a little bit more. So in a way, you can look at a photo like this and visually in your mind replace the snow with just highlights of green or whatever lighter color you're using on the tree. In my trees, I'm using very pale green, kind of a warmer brownish green for the highlighted areas. Of course, later I'm going to add a bit of snow to them, but for now I'm just building up the different sections and the branches. I have to admit that when I started painting the field below, I was getting a little bit frustrated with how sticky my gouache was. I was so tempted to just pour some fresh gouache out, but I don't know why. I was just being stubborn and I was like, no, I'm going to use what's on my palette. But it was to the point where the outer layer of my blue and my brown especially had dried completely. So I was digging into the inner area of the gouache pile with my brush to get any color. However, I do think that this ended up resulting in even more interesting effects in the field because I was using such dry gouache, more than I even planned to. So it ended up being lots and lots of little brush strokes. It took quite a while to do the field. And I was just shifting between different types of browns and reds and greens here and there. And I didn't want to go too bright with the oranges or yellows because I knew I would be adding pops of snow here and there. But I just made sure that at least the area near the edge of the forest caught a little bit more light because I thought that would help define against the shadowy areas of the tree a bit more. By now, as you watch me layer and mix my color, you can really see that I'm not using the water very much. The reason it's so muddy is because, like I said earlier, if I'm using white in any mix, I need to refresh my brush quite a lot. And as I continue through this painting and the gouache dries even more on my palette, it does tend to clog up my hairs even more. So I do have to completely clean it in between a lot of color mixes. In order to add some snow to the scene, I'm following a very basic principle. Snow reflects the atmosphere, what's around it. So if there's a shadowy area of snow, it's going to be a lot darker, maybe even catch some of the greens in the forest. If it's a bright highlighted section of snow, it's going to be very, very bright white. If it was a sunset, it would be reflecting a bit more color. I like to start with the shadowy bits of snow first, so I add some blue to my white and I drop that in very thin layers just below the trees, so it kind of looks like there's little patches of snow back there, but the light isn't hitting them and reflecting. And then in the foreground, I lay in some mounds of blue, and then I'm going to overlay this with dry brush white. And in order to paint my highlighted bits of snow, I need to get some fresh white because mine is all contaminated. And without using any water, I'm going to drop pure white onto any areas that I think the sun would just be hitting the snow directly. hope you enjoyed this little mini tutorial and discussion about dry brush and water control. I have lots of tutorials like this over on Patreon, and again, we're doing trees this month, so consider joining if you want to grow those skills. Thank you all for being here, and I'll see you again soon for another video. Take care.